Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series episode number 95. In this episode, I am joined by Bernardo Kastrup. This conversation is a follow-up of sorts from episode number 94. Michael had about an hour to devote to dialogue with Bernardo and had to leave, and so Bernardo and I were talking after Michael left, and I said, well, would you like to hop on and talk about a few things that have happened recently with you and maybe some broader questions that I might be able to work up. So that's this conversation, and Bernardo, this is his fifth one-on-one conversation with me and seventh appearance overall on this show, and so I really want to acknowledge Bernardo's generosity of his time and thoughts. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. It, again, was very much improvised and off the cuff on my end. I really wasn't prepared to. I just asked him if he wanted to hop on and just go. So if it's a little unpolished on my end, we'll all have to work with that. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to all the new subscribers too. And welcome to the IdeaCast interview series YouTube audience. This is going to be an interesting conversation. Bernardo and I or Dr. Bernardo Kastrup and I had just
no, just
had,
Bernardo.
I
Just
know,
Bernardo.
I'm doing that and you're going to be Bernardo from now on. We just had a conversation with Michael Levin, and I asked Bernardo if he would indulge me and just hop on for a very improvised, ad hoc kind of conversation. So he agreed, and here we are. Bernardo, welcome. So glad to have you as a guest for another conversation. And so
Happy to be here.
and I'm happy to have you as a guest always. I think this is probably our fourth or fifth conversation. So you're very generous with your time, and I am deeply grateful for that, because again, I'm just kind of an average guy just asking questions from that perspective. So, but one of my motivations for bringing you on is there have been incidents in the past where you, as a philosopher and someone who does have a background in science and computer science, try to enter into good faith conversations with interlocutors and being hosted by a third party, by persons like, not like myself, but by third parties. And sometimes things, they fall apart very quickly, or there's obviously this kind of entrenched ideology or metaphysical assumptions that are being held with a rigid apprehension or a dogma, or however we want to frame that. And so that might be the way to start our conversation is we'll talk about something that you've been a champion for your philosophical career, if that's fair to say, and that is breaking down the walls of physicalism and metaphysical materialism. So I'll stop there and get your response to this, and then we'll go back and forth with it.
My response on contentious interactions.
Right. You show up prepared to have a good faith dialogue, a good faith dialectic, and engage. And times when it goes right, when you're with John Vervaeke, it works out really well. Both of you entered into a space together, and he's very, being the Neoplatonist, he's very much about this. He's very much about creating a space where ideas can be moved forward and the individuals don't matter and the ideologies don't necessarily matter, but they're a constituent of the conversation, and that can, again, move ideas forward. And that's how I understand dialectic, is that two people engage in good faith, or two parties engage in good faith to move an idea forward. And that's my idea of skepticism as well. It's not to be cynical, it's not to refute, it's not pseudo-skepticism where you're already rigidly holding on to dogma and you're just going to refute somebody and shut them down. So you, as far as I'm concerned, you're coming into these conversations in good faith, and sometimes it goes well and other times it doesn't. And that speaks to a number of things. And so again, what are your thoughts?
It's human interaction. We are all being human, and human to human, sometimes there is a resonance and an alignment, like we've just had with Michael Levin. Tremendous resonance and alignment, and other times we grate on each other's nerves. It's all part of the show. I wouldn't sort of make of myself a different case. I tend to be civil and respectful in face-to-face conversations. But I also have this other side of me in writing, in which I can attack ideas with strong words.
Mm-hmm.
I can use the same word that um,
Tim Maudlin had used.
Tim Modeling used
Yeah.
against me. He said, "This is all silly. Everything you said is silly." I have used the word "silly" to describe ideas myself in my written work. Of course, the main trigger for me, because I was pretty angry in that conversation with Tim Modeling. I think everybody can see that it was not forced anger. It was very authentic, spontaneous
Mm-hmm.
anger. I flared up, but I flared up looking back at it. I flared up mostly because of his demeanor and tone, which I experienced as being extraordinarily disrespectful. But that personality trait, that tendency to use harsh words, I have that too, and that's probably why I got angry with him, because he was mirroring back to me something that exists in me,
Mm-hmm.
and that I would prefer that it didn't, but it does, and I was confronted with that. Now, at the same time, I also don't want to put myself at the same level of Tim's behavior in that interaction, because I have never been discourteous or disrespectful towards any face-to-face interlocutor. If people think I have, I challenge you to produce the video where I have so immediately, so gratuitously disrespected my interlocutor. That's not part of my personality. But in writing, I have been disrespectful to ideas,
Mm-hmm.
ideas that I consider silly. And there is a reason why I do that in writing. I have even written an essay a few years ago, basically telling people why I do that. And the reason is, historically, over the entire 20th century and even into the 21st century, materialists used to, or have dismissed and poo-pooed other ideas. Um, Anything that was not a materialist idea was treated with contempt and absolute disrespect, dismissed and turned into mystical woo-woo and wishful thinking. So I deliberately try to reflect that attitude towards materialism itself, to poo-poo it, to show how silly and sometimes stupid it is. Um, and I do it on purpose in order to um, make the attitude that materialists have or had towards materialists explicit, and reply at the same with the same language, so to say, and sort of try to invest people who are already on the fence, or who already think materialism doesn't make any sense. Try to um, give these people uh, how do I articulate that? To boost them,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to let them see that they are not the only ones thinking this, to make sure that materialism is seen for what it is, bring it down to earth and show how silly it is. But although there is this deliberate plan behind the tone I take in writing when I am criticizing other ideas, I do use it with gusto. I enjoy it. It's
Mm-hmm.
not. It is deliberate, but I also enjoy it, and I enjoy it because I have that same character trait that was there in team modeling. I just express it in a socially appropriate way. Um, to poo-poo ideas in writing is something that has been legitimized in the West since early 19th century. People like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche were notorious for their very strong assault on other ideas, sometimes even other people. I tend to do that mainly with ideas. I do it with people only if the other person starts.
Mm-hmm.
But in writing, this is okay. This makes sense. In writing, an insult can be a rhetorical cherry on the cake. You already made your case with substance, with argument, with evidence. and then you cap it off with an insult towards an idea, because it sort of brings it home. So there is a rhetorical benefit to doing this, and we have done that since the mid-19th century in an socially acceptable way. But in writing, because in writing, your opponent has time to collect his thoughts or their thoughts and come back at you in a substantive way. And if you use your insult wrongly, that will come back to bite you, because your opponent will have time to sit down, think it through, and use your insult against you. Face to face, you can't do that, because face to face, you will, if you insult too much a person, not an idea, and the person who is right there speaking to you live, if you do that, you psychologically unbalance the other person, which is what team modeling did to me. The responsibility for becoming unbalanced is mine, but the trigger came from him. And I got upset and angry, and I realized I am in no emotional state to come back with the substance, to answer what he was saying with substance. And that's why I answered it in writing in my own personal blog. So in a live face-to-face conversation, insults are bad form. They are not conducive to bringing the issues to the table, to bringing the arguments to the table. In writing, they can actually be conducive to that. They are the rhetorical cherry on top of a cake you already baked in your argumentation. Of course, Tim used that cherry before the cake. He issued the insult before he said anything else, and his attitude and demeanor I found and still find reprehensible and totally not conducive to a conversation. So I'm not apologizing for him. I'm not saying that what he did is okay, but I also don't want to be seen as the noble man in this story.
Right. And in hindsight, and this is something that I took away from it, and maybe it's revealing a little bit of sociopathy on my part, but I would have used that moment, again, retrospectively. I wouldn't have been able to do it in real time, but would that also just give you some ammunition for the debate itself? So in other words, had you not been triggered, had you just said, okay, I'm taking that card that I just got from Maudlin or anyone else that just did an ad hominem attack or an insult, and put that card down on my side and save it for a little later in the conversation, wouldn't have any constructive or utilitarian value, but that was one of the takeaways for me, is like, okay, you want to play by those rules, that's fine, and now let me try to re-enter once again to see if we can establish a dialogue in a constructive dialogue, but nonetheless, he's weakened himself, right? He weakened himself immediately by throwing that out, like you said, just right there in the beginning, instead of trying to be courteous and gracious and listening to what's going on. But again, this is all retrospect. This is all hindsight.
I mean, if I hadn't gotten angry, I could definitely have done that. I'll give you an example. One of the quote arguments he used for saying that everything I had just said was silly was that the many worlds interpretation, which is a physically realist interpretation, can account for the same results that I had just said contradict or refute physical realism. So he said, well, but the many worlds interpretation also predicts these results. And that is silly. The reason being that the many worlds interpretation predicts everything. Everything that can happen is predicted by the many worlds interpretation to actually happen, just in a parallel, inaccessible universe for which we have precisely zero empirical evidence. So to use the predictive power of the many worlds interpretation to call me silly was very ironic. It was quite rich. Because if a theory predicts everything, it might as well predict nothing, which is the case for the many worlds interpretation. It predicts that everything that can possibly happen actually does, even though we can't see it. Well, then it predicts nothing. If you predict everything, you're predicting nothing. You are not differentiating between foreground and background. You have an unfalsifiable theory. So team's appeal to an unfalsifiable theory, to the predictive power of an unfalsifiable theory to justify him calling me silly, was rich, and I could have used it to great effect. But his tone and demeanor really grinded on my nerves. I don't think I could have a conversation with him. I think his character clashes with mine too much. And no, I don't want to have contact with that kind of attitude anymore. No.
No, and I understand that. And speaking of Evertonian many worlds versus bubble universes or multiverses, and you had mentioned that it was unfalsifiable. Oh shoot, I just lost my train of thought. I'll have to get back to it. I'm sorry. So I'll move on to something else about spokespeople of science, which you use as kind of a polemical term, and I wholly agree. I find it interesting that physicists seem to be seduced by the lure, the siren song of popularity and relevance and all these different things, to going from one field-specific lane to opening up multiple lanes. And everyone is entitled to be an armchair philosopher. Everyone's entitled to speculate on things. But I notice that in popular culture and pop sci and pop fi, that we get a lot of people who are born from the field of physics and the understanding of the quanta of being and all this kind of stuff. It could just be simple psychology. It could be correlated to just being happenstantial that they all come from this background. But we could list off a litany of names of people who do this. But I'm wondering if there is, when one understands physics and has a PhD in physics, do they seem to grant license to themselves to then understand from a bottom up causality kind of chain to speak to all these other things? It's like, well, I'm and as kind of an appeal to authority, maybe, is I'm an authority on the foundational aspects of what's going on in reality. Therefore, I can speak to social issues, gender issues, or climate issues, or all these other things. And again, they're fully entitled. Nobody should begrudge anybody anything, but be prepared for the proper peer review and subsequent criticisms that come along. But anyway, to ask a question more straightforward, physicists seem to be susceptible to want to talk about a lot of things, and again, they're fully entitled to. But do you see a motive there? And to go to Maudlin, he is a philosopher of science, and he obviously is focused very much on physics. And so I'm not trying to lump him in with this, but it may be adjacent.
You were thinking of Sabine Hossenfelder.
Well, yeah, and Sabine, years ago, I watched her videos. I had to stop, but years ago, when she was sticking just with physics, I would read criticisms of her work off in ancillary domains, like people who are doing physics would say, oh yeah, Sabine, but nonetheless, years ago she was doing pure physics, and they were, I appreciate it. I like the videos, and it's like Matt with PBS Spacetime, you're getting what you believe to be some honest, as she says, no gobbledygook. But yeah, lately she's branched into philosophy, and she just did one on capitalism not too long ago. And I'm not picking on her. This is not a critique in my own right, but there were so many follow-up videos from economists and theorists of market systems and so forth. And it's just like, Sabine, let's sit down and so I'm concerned, because Sabine could be doing such great work within her wheelhouse, and she has done good work within her wheelhouse, and as have other people. But this speaks to a bigger problem, I guess, and it goes back to what you were saying, where your raison d'etre is to go against, apologies to French speakers, against materialism and physicalism for a better social, the commons, having this conversation about what is reality, what are the grounds. So I'll stop there, because people don't like it when I ramble on too much.
Well, physics has historically been seen as sort of the mother of all sciences, because our mentality is reductionist. Mine too. I am also a reductionist. I just reduce to a different entity than most people are trying to reduce to, but I also reduce things. To me, reduction is synonymous with explanation. To reduce something is to account for it in terms of simpler things. In other words, to explain it. So I'm not against that, but in this reductionist milieu in which we live, physics is the ultimate step of reduction. Everything is supposed to ultimately be reducible to physics. That second part is probably naive. Physics is a science of perception, and therefore it's limited by perception. Our perceptual cognitive apparatus is something that evolved on planet Earth in certain apes over 4 billion years, but there is no reason to think that the perceptual apparatus of humans can access and pick out everything that is relevant about reality. So physics is limited by perception, and some might say, well, but physics has instruments. We have telescopes, we have microscopes, oscilloscopes, particle accelerators. I worked in one. So it's not limited to perception. Of course it is. You still have to perceive the output of all these instruments. So everything gets filtered out through the paradigm of perception in physics. You have to hear the clicking noises of the instrument. You have to see the screen of the oscilloscope. You have to see the image produced by the telescope or the microscope. You have to see the histogram produced on a computer screen after you do your particle collisions at CERN. You still have to perceive. So everything gets filtered out through that paradigm, through the dimensions of the paradigm of perception, which are space, time, form, geometry. So physics is fundamentally limited to that, and the awareness of it lacks. But the other part, which is all of other sciences are supposed to ultimately, insofar as they are also sciences of perception, be reducible to physics. That's correct, and that may lead to some hubris. I don't think anyone is immune to that. I don't necessarily take exception to physicists talking about other things. Maybe I'm less triggered by it than you are. We also have to keep in mind that only some physicists are doing this. Most physicists are too busy doing physics to create YouTube videos and make a living out of that. Most physicists and cosmologists and astronomers, they are too busy doing science to talk about science on television. So we have to keep that in mind. Behind that one big mouth on television or on a YouTube channel, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of others who have their heads down doing science instead of talking about philosophy. So that would be my answer.
Okay. And I did try to bracket this and say that these are the spokespeople of science. And I think I read a statistic last year that between 1,000 and 1,200 PhDs in physics are issued in the United States alone every year. So as you said, there are literally thousands of people who shut up and do the science, as they like to say about themselves. Yeah, I was speaking more generally to the Neil deGrasse Tysons of the world and Sean Carrolls of the world. And I get it. The lure is also, social relevance, money, because you can write books, you can fill auditoriums, you get speaking engagements. I'm not begrudging anybody that, but as again, grounding it in the context of what is the message that's being delivered in the pop-fi, pop-sci culture, in the commons, and people like me who don't have an education, who are asking these, who are having existential issues, which lead to other things. And so this messaging, I think, is deeply important that it be done in an ethically grounded context and not in somebody's bloated ego that says, well, I have my PhD in physics and, here we go, buckle up. I'm going to tell you how everything works.
Yeah, look, it is good, even important, that there is proper science communication. And the best people to communicate science are scientists. So it is part of the necessary educational piping of our culture that some scientists take the time to communicate and educate about science. I think that is important. The problem is that sometimes, maybe a lot of times, the scientists who have taken on that important job and over the years build up a name and a platform for themselves, they become culturally influential. They then maybe misuse that platform to peddle their own opinions about certain things about which they do not really understand the key issues. And then you get Neil deGrasse Tyson making philosophical pronouncements that he does not understand. He does not understand the issues in contention. And that, I think, is highly damaging. And a lot of them succumb to this temptation, not only Neil deGrasse Tyson. You have that baby-faced UK guy, Brian Cox, who does the same thing. They start misusing the authority that they originally attained with legitimacy. They start then misusing it, not to educate about science, but to peddle some position in a field in which they are no specialists at all and have very little knowledge about the issues in contention. That is very damaging. And I don't know whether Sabine did it. I have respect for some of her technical content. She published a video recently with some thoughts about entropy, which is physics. It's her field.
Yeah.
And I thought those thoughts were very, very intriguing and worthy of pursuing further. But when she debated me, she basically lied to my face about something she claimed to have done that turned out she didn't do at all. So I was not happy about that. But that doesn't detract from the value of some of the technical things she puts forward, like that discussion on entropy. So yeah, I don't think we can take any single person and dismiss everything this person has to say, or endorse everything that person has to say. You know, there are multiple Sabine Hossenfelders. There was the Sabine that talked to me and lied to my face. There's the Sabine that shared some very interesting ideas, revolutionary ideas about entropy that I think are probably correct and should be pursued. And there is the Sabine that talks about, I don't know, culture and economics. I don't watch that one. So, so it is important to not throw away the baby with the bathwater. In other words, it's important that that because Sabine lied to my face in a debate, that we have to ignore everything she has to say. I don't think that's valid. It would be like saying we have to throw away all of Wagner's symphonies because he was a bloody, stupid anti-Semite. We can't do that. We have to remember he was a stupid anti-Semite, but he composed surreal, amazing, magical stuff. Or we cannot throw away everything that came out of Heidegger because he was a Nazi party member. I mean, he should absolutely be trounced for being a Nazi party member. But if we are going to throw away what people produce because of the censorable or wrong turns they took in their lives, then we will throw away the entirety of culture, because nobody goes through life without making one or another egregious mistake. And if we were going to throw away the amazing productions of some people because of that egregious mistake they made, there will be nothing left in Western culture. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Let's not throw away the role, educational role, that Neil deGrasse Tyson has played. And he has played another social role just by being who he is. I don't need to get into that, but he has done important things. Let's not throw that away because of his silly, let me use the word, silly philosophical pronouncements pronouncements that not only are misinformed, but which he pronounces with a lot of authoritativeness and confidence, which sort of makes a charade out of it. And that's bad. That's censurable, and we should highlight that. We should talk about it. We should create awareness of that in our culture. But at the same time, not throw away the baby with the bathwater, and finding that balance is the tricky thing.
And thank goodness for the court of informed public opinion, or in more disciplined environs, we have peer review and the running of somebody's publication through that peer review process. I think there's a very similar street level review process. It may not be peer level, but there are people who, like, again, with Hassenfelder's take on capitalism, a number of people who do have genuine authority in market systems analysis and finance and all this kind of thing, were refuting the claims being made. And to me, that would be a teaching moment for epistemic humility and saying, and if you would just, and to Sean Carroll's credit, a lot of times Sean says, hey, listen, this is the best information we have right now, despite his metaphysical assumptions, like in Evertonian many worlds, that, he does have that kind of humility. He's like, this is the best information that we have available right now. And I'm saying this speculatively. I've heard him say that because I do like Sean Carroll. I follow his work and other people in that regard. So yeah, I completely agree. But again, it lends itself back to this idea where the spokespeople of science, people hang on every word. I mean, you see people who are fans of Sabine's work and they defend her, no matter what, because they have purchased this sort of co-agency or whatever it is that's going on there, this maybe a transference process in psychology, I don't know.
It's the opposite mistake of throwing away the baby with the bathwater, which is to recognize the value that comes from some people a lot of the times, to think that because this person said all of those important, good, productive things, that then you have to agree with everything else that person has to say, that everything that person has to say then is right. That's the opposite mistake. And some people do that with the big spokespeople of science. People do that with me. It would be an error to think that if you think Bernardo is right regarding analytic idealism, that you have to agree with Bernardo's political views, which I do share. I do share because I think it's important for every more or less visible member of our society that gets some visibility in the culture to share their political views. But it would be a tremendous error for people who think I'm right about idealism to think I therefore, for that reason alone, I am also right about politics. That would be an error. I may be right about politics, but I may not be. And if I'm not, that doesn't detract from the value of my philosophy either.
Yeah. So it's learning to...
Yeah, this is a kind of maturity that we still have to evolve as a society. We tend to take everything black and white. Yeah. If somebody said something wonderful, beautiful, and correct, then we have to believe everything that person has to say. Or if somebody said something that is censurable and idiotic and even dangerous, then we have to discard everything else that person had to say. Neither extreme is productive to growth, conducive to growth.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for that, just for sorting it out, because maybe this can get out into the commons and people can do with it what they will. But I do appreciate you just opening up and expanding on this a little bit, because again, I know, having followed your work for I don't know how many years now, I know one of the things, your motives, your impetus is to have a better good faith dissemination of information from physics and from ontology and metaphysics that follow from what physicists do or what good faith researchers do. Now, getting back to, I finally remembered what it was I wanted to ask you about Evertonian many worlds. If I were to lens that postulate through your work or through sort of a ontology of intelligence or mind only, is it unhealthy to take the claim? So the claim in Evertonian perspective here, as dealing with quantum physics, is if I, as a experiencing perceptual agent, make a move, like I move my left hand, that the speculation in Evertonian, the postulate is that there's a counterfactual, an abstract counterfactual, that I actually in fact moved my right hand, and in that
another universe,
right, in that abstract counterfactual. Now, so to an attempt at a synthesis that could go terribly wrong here, as someone who appreciates your work on objective idealism, analytical idealism, and that mind is the ontological primitive, or the field of subjectivity, is there any merit in the idea that the movement of the left hand has a potential counterfactual value not concretely, not to be reified in a separate physical universe, but in potentiality, in the imagination of that, and that might be a terrible word, but in the what ifs and the possibilities of the binary, that it was either left or right that was chosen, or whatever sort of, dichotomous decision was made by an observing agent, which when you speak of an observing or measuring agent, the moon doesn't measure, but is it still beholden to this Evertonian many worlds theory? I mean, it cannot execute the way. So when they talk of the people like David Deutsch or Sean Carroll or Maudlin talk about many worlds, almost seems like they're granting a pass to a gentle, conscious interaction, relationality with the physical universe, which to me seems odd. But anyway, I'll stop there because you can straighten me out on all of this. But I think, again, stopping short of reifying that counterfactual that is pure abstraction, does that lend itself at all to having any credibility to what you talk about?
Well, to consider the counterfactual in mind as an abstraction, I think is valid. Often counterfactuals are the background that leads to the information in the foreground. If you ignore the counterfactual, then there is no information. You see that not only in physics, you see that in the neuroscience of consciousness as well. Counterfactuals are key to integrated information theory in the neuroscience of consciousness. The problem is when you reify the counterfactual and you give it the same ontological status as the thing that actually happened and which you can measure, which you can observe. When you say that the counterfactuals, the things that didn't happen, that were not observed, that were not measured, when you say that they have the same ontological status as the thing that has been measured, then you're bastardizing the notion of measurement. You're contradicting a key tenet of physics, which is observation. You are saying that the non-observed has the same ontological status as that which is observed. Then what is observation then all about? If it doesn't distinguish between outcomes that were observed and outcomes that aren't observed, if you don't distinguish between these two, then there is a very strong sense in which you are contradicting the very basis of physics, a science of perceptual observation. Now, why do they do that? I think what happens, look, I am not fundamentally against parallel universes, but there are many different types of parallel universes and many different reasons to contemplate the hypothesis of parallel universes. Parallel universes in the context of Everettian many words interpretation, I think that is ludicrous. But there are other reasons for us to contemplate other types of parallel universes. So I'm not issuing a blanket denial of parallel universes here, but I do issue a denial of parallel universes for Hugh Everett's reasoning, which is the following. In quantum mechanics, it's a bit, I would describe it in a bit old-fashioned way, but that's the most conducive way for this question. There are two processes in quantum mechanics. One is the evolution of the wave function, which is entirely deterministic and predictable. If we had all relevant information, we would be able to model and predict exactly how the wave function is evolving over time. But when you make a measurement, then people speak of a collapse of the wave function, because a wave function is basically a wave of probabilities, superposed overlapping probabilities. But when you make a measurement, you see only one outcome and not multiple outcomes at the same time. So this second process is nonlinear, and it seems to be random as far as we can determine. We can accurately predict the statistics of multiple measurements very accurately, but we cannot predict the outcome of any one single measurement. Any one single measurement appears to be random. And then because of that, because we cannot predict the outcome of any one single measurement, we say that all outcomes actually were produced in multiple parallel universes, and we just happen to be in the universe in which we see that outcome we see. But all the other possible outcomes entailed by the wave function actually exist in a parallel, inaccessible universe for which we have precisely zero empirical evidence. So I will say this again, but in other words, and shorter now, so you grasp where I'm going with this. Because we can't predict the outcome of any one single measurement, therefore, multiple parallel universes. In other words, our inability to create physics that predicts everything leads to the ontological statement, an ontological statement that is the most inflationary that there could ever be. An epistemic limitation leads to an ontological claim that is extraordinarily inflationary, more inflationary than you can possibly conceive. Do you see the error?
Mm-hmm.
Because monkeys can't predict the outcome of single events, ergo myriad parallel universes.
Right.
I don't think this is right reasoning. I don't think it works like that. I think it defies the very spirit of physics, which is measurement and observation and creating models that allow us to couch our observations in a coherent way.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to take things that have not been measured and give them the same ontological status as everything that has been measured, I don't think this is physics. And it's a kind of philosophy, but very bad philosophy, because it exquisitely violates the principle of parsimony. Under the many worlds interpretation, every single microscopic interaction anywhere in the universe splits the universe in two equally large universes. Now, can you even conceive how many single microscopic interactions are happening in the universe in one Planck time? No, you can't even conceive of that.
Yeah.
You can't even put a number of that. Now imagine in a second, how many Planck times are there in a second? 10 to the power of 33.
Something like 33, okay.
In 1 second. Now imagine throughout the history of the universe. I mean, this is an unfathomable chain reaction. It's an atomic explosion of unverifiable stuff that is being postulated here. And we do that because epistemically, we haven't reached the point where we can predict the outcome of any single quantum measurement. I don't think this makes sense. Oh, you have a Floki too, Justin.
Yeah, I have my Floki. That's Spot the cat over there. She's getting ready to settle in for a nap. You can see why they called her Spot. Little spots everywhere.
A big spot.
Yeah, right on the rear end there. Good cat though. Oh, she's gonna stare at the door for a minute. So yeah, thank you for that. Because I when I first heard of that Evertonian many worlds theory, I thought, wow, oh, that's interesting. But yeah, it just seems like an escape hatch for preserving other metaphysical attachments or adherences, or however you want to frame that. Just
if I can speak a little bit more about this. Sorry if I'm overwhelming you, but
no,
look,
that's okay.
The spirit of the motivation, I even agree with it. The spirit of it is that to imagine nature as throwing dice isn't productive. Mm-hmm. Einstein said that, and he was wrong at the surface level, but he may have been right at a deeper level. And I actually agree with Einstein. I think to say that nature throws dice is not coherent, because if not determinism, then all you have is randomness. But randomness, in my view, is a purely epistemic concept. Randomness is what we say when we are incapable of finding a pattern in the data we observe. But to say that the data we observe is random in and of itself, I think goes a step too far. Our inability, the monkey's inability to discern a pattern in data doesn't mean that there is no pattern in the data. Mm-hmm. I don't think the concept of ontological randomness makes sense. I think it's purely epistemic. I think everything that happens because it is part of a causal chain. And the reason I would do that, I think that is that to imagine that an event can happen that is not part of a causal chain is of the same order and type as a Big Bang. In other words, you're basically saying that something appeared out of nothing for no reason. To say that an event is fundamentally and ontologically random is to say that it is a singularity of the same type as the Big Bang, even though not at the same degree.
Mm-hmm.
It's something popping out of nothing for no reason. I don't think that is coherent. It may not even be coherent for the Big Bang, but at least we reduce it to only one event instead of saying that every single interaction in the universe is a kind of Big Bang. It's something that appears out of nothing for no reason. I don't think that makes sense. I don't think there is fundamental randomness in nature. So I agree with the motivation. We are trying to make the universe deterministic, and they do that by fantasizing about this unimaginable number of parallel universes popping up every Planck scale, every Planck time. The other way to think about it is to understand that it is the physical universe that may not be causally closed. In other words, there may be physical events that cannot be accounted for in terms of other physical events. But because we tend to take the physical universe as the only universe, if the physical universe is not causally closed, then there is randomness. And therefore, there must be gazillions of physical universes that we cannot access. The other alternative is much simpler, much more parsimonious, I dare to say much more logical, reasonable, much more physics-like, which is the following. The physical universe is not the universe as it is in itself. The physical universe is the outcome of a measurement. Like a dashboard of an airplane, the dial indications on the dashboard display the result of measurements that the airplane sensors are making on the states of the sky. If the airplane sensors do not measure, then the dials on the dashboard show nothing. But that doesn't mean that because you're not measuring them, there are no states of the sky. Of course there are. The states of the sky are there, whether you're measuring them or not. But if you don't measure them, your dashboard shows nothing. In my view, the physical world is the dashboard. If we don't measure the world, the dashboard shows nothing. There's no physical world. That doesn't mean that the world that is measured doesn't exist. Of course it exists. It's there, whether you're measuring it or not. Now notice that the dynamics of the dials on the dashboard may have correlations.
Mm-hmm.
Your dial of airspeed indication may correlate with the dial that shows engine power. They are correlated in such a way that you could even say that the movement of one dial is caused by the movement of another. If the dial that reads engine power goes up, then the dial that shows airspeed indication goes up. And you can speak of intra-dashboard causality, one dial causing another dial. It's valid in practice, but in principle, fundamentally, it's wrong, because what's actually happening is that the dynamics of every dial are caused by external states that are themselves not in the dashboard, by the engine, by the air in the sky outside. That is the actual link of causality. So if the physical world is just our dashboard of dials, physical causality is not ultimate, it's penultimate. It's just a way to capture the correlations across dial movements, but all causality is coming from behind the physical world, the world that is measured. And that world is causally closed, even if the dashboard, even if the physical world is not. You may have two dials in a dashboard that move in ways that are not correlated. Or you may have one dial that moves in a way that's not correlated with any other dial. That's your quantum measurement. It seems to be random because it cannot be accounted for in terms of the dynamics of the other dials. But it is still caused in a deterministic way by the thing that is being measured, by the non-physical layer of reality. And when I say non-physical, I don't mean spiritual, mystical. No, what I mean is states that are not amenable to description through physical quantities. That's all I mean. There are states out there, probably non-extended states, that are not amenable to description through quantities such as mass, charge, momentum, spin, geometrical relationships, amplitude, frequency. No, it cannot be described by that, because we invented these descriptions to describe the movement of the dials on the dashboard. We didn't invent them to describe the thing that is measured out there in the sky. So we would need other forms of description. So on that basis, I would say there is a non-physical world, a world not describable through those quantities that we invented to describe the dashboard. And that non-physical world out there, the real world, the thing that is measured, I think it is causally closed and deterministic. And that's how God does not throw dice. The physical world is not causally closed. If you stick to the dials on the dashboard alone, there is apparent randomness, but it's only apparent because the thing that is measured, that thing is non-random, that thing is causally closed. I think that is better than to say that the universe is deterministic, because there are gazillions of physical universes popping up into existence out of nothing every Planck time for no reason.
Right. Now, I have a naive question about Evertonian thinking, and that does an asteroid participate in this bifurcation through counterfactuals? Did they give that capacity to what we would call an inanimate object, such as a moon orbiting or an asteroid moving through the whatever belt it might be part of in a solar system?
They have to.
Well, that's interesting too, because I would confine it to an agential process, something like you or myself making conscious decisions or measurements or collapsing things. And so to speak to what we would call an inanimate object, also participating in this dissolution of or whatever this process could be framed when something like that is doing it, that I find that intriguing that they would, and it almost speaks of a kind of vitalism that this is, and this is probably really not sporting of me to say that, but it speaks to that asteroid having some causal property.
Yeah, well, in classical quantum mechanics, so not field theory, not electrodynamics, in classical quantum mechanics, every interaction either creates an interference, in other words, either adds to the superposition, becomes entangled, or it leads to a measurement or a collapse. You cannot, it would be incoherent to speak of living entities as being different from any other system that interacts, because under many worlds interpretation, living beings are just physical systems, just like an electronic detector is. And we are physical systems that interact with other physical systems. There is nothing special about us. Under analytic idealism, it's different, because under analytic idealism, the physical world is the dashboard of a dissociated entity in that field of subjectivity that underlies all nature, that is all nature. And therefore, it's only living beings that have dashboards. Living beings can be modeled as a process surrounded by a Markov blanket. And it is the states of the Markov blanket that interact with the world and lead to the formation of an internal dashboard, a sort of a set of dials that cover the inner surface of our Markov blanket and convey information about external states to us. So if the physical world is the dashboard of dials, if the physical world is a Markov blanket, then only living beings have physical worlds. The world as it is in itself, the real external world, that which does not depend on measurement, that isn't physical. It's not amenable to description by physical quantities. It's the thing that is measured. Physical worlds only appear in the Markov blanket of living beings. Then you have this distinction that you're looking for. Only living beings have physical worlds because only living beings are surrounded by a Markov blanket. Only living beings have that dissociative boundary that we model as a Markov blanket. So but there, everything makes sense. You know, there is a real world out there, external world, does not depend on my looking at it. But the physical world is the result of my looking at the real world and representing the results of my measurements to myself. The physical world is not shared. The physical world resides in each of our Markov blankets. You have a physical world, I have another.
Mhm.
Why are they mutually consistent? Because both reflect the measurements of a real external reality, which
Mhm.
is not physical in the sense of not being describable through physical quantities. So there you have what passes for collapse, because only living beings represent things physically. And when you represent them, there is only one alternative that you observe, not a superposition of alternatives. And the superposition is our model, psi is our model of the world as it is in itself. And all we have is a model, because every time we look, we get a representation in our Markov blanket. And that's only one possibility.
Mhm.
So it looks as though collapse has happened, and collapse only happens with living beings, because only living beings can represent things on their dashboard.
Mhm.
The representation on the dashboard is a physical world, and the physical world is always one possibility and not a superposition.
Yeah. Okay.
And the superposition is just our own intellectual model of the real external world. It's just a model. The wave function is not ontic, it's epistemic. It's
Mhm.
our own model based on our own knowledge, what we
Mhm.
know about those real external states that are non-physical. You still don't have that magical idea that consciousness collapses the real states of the world out there,
Yeah.
as if consciousness had the magical power of changing the universe by merely looking at it.
Mm.
No, you don't need that. And by the way, I'm completely against this notion of granting consciousness the magical powers of changing the world, of collapsing the wave function of the universe. I think it's nonsensical. Why? Because I think the physical universe is not out there. It's our own internal representation. And that consciousness has the power to do. Consciousness has the power to, quote, collapse its own representations of the real external world. Of that, there's nothing magical about that.
Mhm.
Consciousness creates its own representations of the real world. We call that collapse, fine. But it doesn't change the real states of the world out there. It only changes the states of the physical world. And the physical world belongs within individual consciousness because it's the Markov blanket of that individual consciousness. That's how I make sense of things to myself. And I submit to you, this is a lot more rational, reasonable, empirically consistent, and parsimonious than uncountable parallel universes popping into existence in every Planck time.
In speaking to the dashboard of dials that our Markov blanket systems use, could that be considered a species of representationalism in a cognitive sense? And when we talk about cognitive science, is that a particular, because representationalism can mean different things to different people, but would you say that's a species of that then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. The notion of living beings being defined by their Markov blankets came out of cognitive science.
Okay. Okay.
So, I didn't invent it. So I think what we call the physical universe is a cognitive representation. It is not out there. It is in here. It's our internal dashboard of dials to display to ourselves the measurements we make on the states of the real world. In Kantian terminology, the physical world is pure phenomena. And the thing that is measured in order to give rise to the physical world, that thing are the noumena.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the naive philosophical mistake physics has made throughout history is to take the contours, the geometrical relationships that appear on the screen of perception. In other words, the contours of the representations for the contours of the thing represented. Physicists understand that there are no colors in the world out there. They understand that colors are our internal representations. The redness of an apple exists in me, not out there in the world. They understand that.
Mm-hmm.
But then they say that the shape of the apple exists out there, not only in me. Why? If the color is a representation, so are the contours, so are the geometrical relationships.
Mm.
To think otherwise is to think that because the dials on a dashboard are round, then every cloud in the sky should be round.
Okay.
Why? Roundness is a geometrical property of the dashboard, of the representation, not necessarily of the thing represented. But physics is physicists, not physics, physicists base their understanding of the universe on this unthought idea that the contours of the screen of perception are the contours of the real world. In other words, if I see a ball bouncing in my perception, conscious perception of the world, then there is a real ball bouncing out there in the world. It may not be orange, like the ball bouncing on my screen of perception, but it is a sphere, and it is bouncing up and down in a kind of objective scaffolding of space-time that exists out there, not only in here. I find that naive and unjustified. We grant that colors are part of perceptual representations. Why we will not grant that the contours and the dynamics are also of the representations? When we see a dial moving on an airplane dashboard, we don't think that there is a big dial moving in the sky outside. We don't. Now, there is something happening in the sky outside that correlates with the movement of the needle in the dial. But we don't think there is a big needle out there. No, there is something that correlates with it. In the same sense, a basketball bouncing on the screen of perception is correlated with something happening out there. Granted that there is something, some dynamics out there that correlates with the basketball bouncing, because the dashboard should correlate with the real world. Otherwise, the dashboard is useless. But that doesn't mean that there is a basketball bouncing out there.
Yeah.
No.
So we can be humble and take this epistemology to be asymmetrical and say that, you know, within our interaction with the dashboard, the experience of physical activity or shape or form is what we are the recipients of, whereas on the, again, it maybe asymmetrical isn't the right word, but what's really going on is of no import for how we comport ourselves or function in the world. But
well, it is important in the sense that, you know, suppose you're a pilot and you're flying by instruments alone because it's too dark outside.
Right.
If you don't take the dial indications seriously from your dashboard, you're going to crash and burn.
Yeah.
The dynamics of the dials do capture important and relevant information about the states of the sky. They just aren't the states of the sky. The dashboard isn't the sky. It just conveys important information about the sky, and you need to take that information seriously, otherwise you crash and burn. The same thing for perception. My contention is that the basketball bouncing on the screen of perception is just a dial moving on the dashboard.
Right.
There is no basketball bouncing in the real world. But we have to take the bouncing of the basketball seriously for the same reason that we have to take seriously if we see a truck approaching us, you know, coming in our direction. If you don't take that seriously, you're going to die, because the dashboard evolved to convey important, actionable information about the world.
Right.
It correlates with the world. It just isn't the world.
Right.
So that's why I was saying it's unreasonable to expect the dashboard to be causally closed. What is causally closed is the world that is represented by the dashboard. And yes, the dial movements within different dials in the dashboard will correlate with one another. That may lead you to think of internal dashboard causality. You can even model things very accurately that way. But what is actually happening is not that one dial is causing the movement of another. What is happening is that the movements of both dials are being caused by a real world behind the dials. So we don't need the Everetian many worlds. We don't need that to have a deterministic, causally closed universe. All we need is to understand that physicality is not the universe as it is in itself. Physicality is a representation thereof. Physicality doesn't need to be causally closed. What needs to be causally closed is the thing that physicality represents.
And so perhaps I'll refine that asymmetrical relationship that, you know, we should have strong epistemic value in what's going on in our relationship with the dashboard and the dials and things that help us represent bouncing basketballs and so forth. But the asymmetry that, and I'm expanding the lens out a little bit here, is that we don't want to confuse ourselves with the noumena, to use Kantian language, that's occurring there. And that's what science and philosophers like yourself should be doing. But I'm thinking in, again, everyday activity that we, we just hold that epistemic value to our relationship with the dashboard and dials, but maybe not, again, use the map territory analogy and try to confuse and construct Evertonian theories and things like that. So maybe that's what I meant by the asymmetrical relationship there.
And to link it back to the theme of our conversation, Justin, why are people like Sean Carroll, which are clearly intelligent, reasonable people, why are they running with this frankly absurd idea of Everetian parallel universes? There can be parallel universes for other reasons of other types, but it's absurd if motivated in this manner. It's absurd if motivated by the fact that every time we make a measurement, there is only one outcome and we can't predict that. If that's your motivation to talk about many worlds, I think that's absurd. So why are intelligent people peddling it? I think this is deserving of psychological study, and I don't mean by this to sound pejorative. I mean this very objectively. I think the psychology here is a deeply ingrained intuition that most of us share, especially those of us involved in science and analytic philosophy, that randomness cannot be ontic. There cannot be ontological randomness. God doesn't play dice. He really doesn't, or
Right.
they really don't. And I share that intuition with Sean Carroll. But because he's so committed to the notion of the physical universe being the thing that is measured, there is no other way for him to honor this deeply ingrained intuition other than to speak of gazillions of parallel universes for which we have no empirical evidence and no way to access, which contradicts the very spirit of physics as a science of measurement. If you surrender that unexamined assumption and you realize that what we call the physical world is a representation, that the thing measured and represented as the physical world is itself not amenable to description through physical quantities. If you understand this, then you can apply full determinism, full causality to the states of the real world, and you understand that those causal chains will only be partly reflected on the dashboard, on the representation, just like the dynamics of dials in an airplane's dashboards only reflect the actual dynamics of the sky out there. If you make this step, there is no need for the many worlds interpretation in our attempt to stick to our deeply felt intuition that randomness cannot be ontological. It's not. There is no randomness in the real world. It's just that the real world is not the physical world.
Right, right. No, there's clarity in that, and I try to adhere to that when I think about these kind of things, So how are you on time? Because I think I have two more questions for you, and then
yeah, we can cover two more questions.
All right, I appreciate it. So sticking in the realm of the dashboard of dials and perception and so forth, you have been recently talking about IIT, so I want to enfold that into this question. But firstly, I would ask, have you looked into Carl Friston's work with free energy principle and Bayesian inference and things like that?
Well, all my talk of Markov blankets, they come from there.
Okay, because I really find his work intriguing. I actually, I have a very shallow depth of understanding because, who am I? But I love Friston's work in the sense that it's error minimization. He talks in the free energy. It reminds me a lot of what you say with the dashboard of dials, that we would become entropic soup if we were to actually have one-to-one mapping and direct access. And I had mentioned to you off record a couple of years ago, I think in one of our first conversations, that Sylvester James Gates, who's at the University of Maryland, when he was doing just after his doctoral thesis in the early 90s, they were doing maths related to supersymmetry. And in those maths that he was doing, all of the equations, there was error correcting code that they found that's very similar to the dual block linear self error correcting code that software people use. And so at that ontological primitive there, there is error correcting, error minimization or error correction going on. And then again, Fristen's work speaks to this in terms of updating of priors and the free energy principle in error minimization. I want to just put that on the table, but then also, and this may be apples and oranges, you've recently been talking about IIT as a means of integration of information. So if you want to talk about Fristen first, or we're good, and then go into IIT, or somehow synthesize the two.
Yeah, we can synthesize the two. Yeah, it's
okay,
possible to synthesize the two.
Okay, wonderful.
But there are two tragedies related to the work of Carl Fristen. Tragedy number one is that it's surprising how many people in the neuroscience of consciousness do not understand Fristen. And it has come to a point where people are no longer ashamed to say they don't understand Fristen. They say that as a badge of honor now. Like, oh yeah, I don't understand Fristen. Who does understand Fristen? Nobody understands Fristen. So we don't need to make an effort to understand Fristen. I think that's a tragedy, because there is content there that is very valuable. The other tragedy is that even the people who think they understand a little bit, they apply that understanding in a completely biased manner. For instance, people who understand that according to Fristen, our internal cognitive states do not mirror the actual states of the world. Our internal cognitive states are encoded inferential representations of the states of the world. They don't mirror the states of the world. We don't see the world as it is. What we see is a sort of an encoded summary, an encoded inferential summary that tries to convey as much information about the world as possible, but while putting an upper bound in the dispersion of our internal states, putting an upper bound in our internal entropy. Otherwise, we would just melt into warm goulash soup. So people understand that. The people who understand that, some of them then proceed to apply this only to optical illusions. Like that rotating face mask, remember, that you can see it either as hollow or concave. Sorry, either as convex or concave.
Oh, that's right.
And so they say, well, we can arbitrarily see it as either convex or concave because what we perceive is an inferential encoded representation of the real states of the world. So they apply that to optical illusions. But when it comes to this bottle of water, they think implicitly, they think that, oh, we see it as it really is, because this is not a bottle of water. Well, if you go through Fristen's formalism, he never makes a distinction between optical illusions and other perceptual contents. All of them are encoded inferential representations of the real external states beyond the Markov blanket. So you cannot stop at optical illusions. You have to consistently apply that to everything. There is no bottle out there. What I call a bottle is an encoded inferential representation, but people don't take that next step. So they cherry pick. They cherry pick his entire argument to explain what they feel uncomfortable with, optical illusions, but then they ignore it when it comes to what they feel comfortable with, which is a physical world reflecting the real reality. But it doesn't work like that. That's not how the argument can be applied. You either say, I think it's wrong, and you don't apply it, and then you don't apply it to optical illusions. Or you say it's right, and then you have to apply it for every content of perception. In the same way that there is no concave or convex mask, there is no bottle, there is no sun, there is no body, there is no brain. You have to apply that to the brain. The brain is itself an inferential encoded representation of real states of the world, but those real states don't look like a brain. The brain is our internal cognitive representation of those states. Our internal cognitive states do not mirror the states of the world. Otherwise, there would be no upper bound to our internal entropy, because there is no a priori upper bound to the entropy of the external world. I mean, the argument is very simple. Now, I feel that Fristen is to blame for some of this, because, you know, it took me like a week to go over one of his papers and satisfy myself he was not pulling a rabbit out of a hat. And then when you understand the conclusion, if Fristen would have just started with the conclusion that is so intuitive as to be self-evident. He would have made the whole thing much more accessible, but he doesn't. He uses math as a kind of language. Both non-mathematicians and mathematicians get aggravated by it. The non-mathematicians get aggravated because they don't understand the symbols, and they think it's too obscurantist, and they give up on that. The mathematicians get aggravated by it because Friston doesn't use math in the mathematician's way. Mathematicians would start from a set of axioms and then apply rules of derivation or theorems and arrive at a conclusion. And you never add new first principles in the middle of that derivation. You start from the axioms and you go to the conclusion. You don't add things from the sides. But Friston adds things from the sides. As he is deriving, he says, oh, and by the way, because of this, this, and that, and some other first principle, and then he inserts that in the derivation. And that aggravates mathematicians a lot because it breaks the cleanness of the thing. So what Friston does is he uses mathematics in the same way he would use English. Instead of discursively writing things out, he uses mathematical symbols. But he uses those mathematical symbols as language, as if you were talking in English. So it aggravates everybody.
I can get that. Oh yeah, because I've looked at that and I'm like, it's way over my head, and I'm not even an academic or an intellectual. So I can see.
I think that these two tragedies of his work that most people wear not understanding his work as a badge of honor, people in neuroscience of all people, and that people who do understand a bit apply it with bias. Both of these tragedies are at least partly caused by Friston himself. I don't think he needs to make things as complicated or I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think there is a jewel underneath all these layers of seeming obscurantism. I think he's onto something.
Okay. And now to IIT and your recent I don't want to say embracing, but you're warming up to IIT because
I have been warming up since 2017. Now I can say I embrace it.
Okay. Yeah, you even went to a convention recently, I think I heard you say, or you wrote somewhere that you had gone to a meeting with people who work with IIT. Okay. So
a couple of dozen people working on IIT got together in a very small island in the Venice Lagoon.
Oh, okay.
An island called San Servolo. And we just spent morning, afternoon, and evening with each other every day for a whole week, Saturday to Saturday, hashing out IIT. So that was the culmination of my sort of warming up to IIT since 2007, which I kept sort of secret because, not because it was a secret, but because I didn't want to come out before I had a full understanding of what I was going to talk about. And now I am comfortable enough that I can say to you in public, I embrace IIT. I think it is not only the most promising, it's the only tenable attempt to model the structure of consciousness that we have today. Now, how does it dovetail with the Friston's free energy principle and his idea of Markov blankets and representations? Under IIT, we can model perceptual states in the form of a graph with vertices and edges connecting those vertices. So the qualities that constitute perceptual experience can be modeled that way. And in IIT, we call that graph, that connected graph, we call it a perceptual complex, a complex. There are other complexes in IIT that do not need to be perceptual. You can have endogenous complexes like abstract lines of thinking inside our own heads, or emotions, or feelings, intuitions. These are not modulated by perceptual input, but they also are constituted of qualities that are connected to one another in a unified way. So you can model that connection across different qualities as a connected graph in which edges are qualities and, vertices are qualities and edges are the way the qualities come together to form a unitary experience. So you have a psychic complex in IIT that is endogenous experience, such as understanding, interpretation, thought. And you have other complexes in IIT that are perceptual. They model how the qualities of perceptual experience, such as color, shape, tone, texture, how they come together. You model this as a connected graph. You model interpretation and thinking as a connected graph. So you can have two connected graphs. Stay with me. I'm almost getting there. I know it's difficult, but I'm almost getting there. Now, IIT says that conscious experience is always unitary. There is integrated information that unifies experience. I can't take the quality of black that I see in your headset and split that from the total experience of seeing you on my computer screen. That blackness is an integral part of a unitary experience, the experience of seeing you on my computer screen, and the screen itself and whatever is behind my screen that I can still pick up with my peripheral vision. So in IIT, the graph that models perception and the graph that model understanding cannot be disjoint. We always experience them as one graph. They come together. They become woven in one another. And as part of that weaving, some of the edges of these graphs fall out through the exclusion principle.
Okay.
But under IIT, there is no perception separate from interpretation. Your thoughts that we call the interpretation of a perception, they are always in the same connected unitary graph as your perceptual states. There is no perceiving without interpretation. Perceiving already entails an interpretation of perception. There are no pure perceptual states that can be experienced in and of themselves. Every time you interpret as part of the experience of perception. Because of these principles of IIT that require these two graphs to be connected in a unitary experience. This dovetails very nicely with Friston, because Friston is essentially saying the same thing. There are no pure perceptual states. Our perception is already an interpretation that is inferential and encoded in order to minimize internal entropy. That's how IIT can be used to model Friston's notion that there are no perceptual states that mirror the world. No, they are already encoded through these interpretational graphs of thinking. So yeah, I will not say that one theory replaces the other. No, they come from different sides and they have different emphasis and they cover different areas, but there is overlap, and they certainly can be reconciled in a very natural way. You can bring in Friston's insights into IIT in a very natural way that does not require you to massage the theory in any way. It just lands perfectly into IIT. You do not need to create new mechanisms. You do not need to change anything in the way information is treated. It just makes sense.
Well, I look forward to that integration in your work to see what comes of that. So thank you for sharing that, and thank goodness for Rewind. I'll just listen back to what you were saying and continue. I really honestly, I've poured a lot of time and energy into Friston's work, and again, I'm me, and so it's going to take a long time to really have a firm grasp, but I haven't even started on IIT. I've heard of it. I've heard Coke talk about it and a few other people. So I had very, very flimsy apprehension of it, but I do want to especially since there was that polemic attack recently on IIT, it got my attention again. And I'm like, oh yeah, let me go back and see what's going on that causes these people to get triggered and do a manifesto that, whatever, all that crap that went on Twitter or whatever.
I bet with you it was not the theory itself. What triggered them was that IIT was getting a lot of attention, a lot of media, a lot of funding, and then there is academic jealousy. And,
okay.
And that's how
they all huddle together and wave their sticks. Torches.
And also, you can write 3 paragraphs and upload it to the archive with 100 names, and you get a lot of citations in your H index, if you know what I mean.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Very
Okay.
free, very cheap citations,
A
but you
little,
get a lot of it, and
a
your
lot of
H index
charity.
will explode. So that's convenient too.
Aha. Yeah. One of the other motives I see. I didn't even,
That's the nit and gritty, dirty world of academia
oh
there.
my goodness. Yeah, right. All about posturing and status and things like that. So to bring us in for a bit of a soft landing, I'll ask one last question quickly, and if you're good on time.
Sure.
Having talked about everything we've talked about, are you seeing a future of reformation in neuroscience? And do you know of people who are maybe going to help lead or spearhead a reformation in neuroscience? And it's not to say that people who do neuroscience from a particular perspective shouldn't continue to do it this way. And again, maybe these are physicalist assumptions or other theories that may not align with things that we've been talking about, but that as you know, the evolution of a field, things will tend to fall off if they're not necessarily functional or have good utility. Are you seeing that in neuroscience, or what is your thoughts for the future of neuroscience? And Michael touched on that earlier, Dr. Levin, when we talked about, you know, neuroscience shouldn't be so much about this, you know, this thing up here as much as it is more of a holistic thing. So what are your thoughts on that before we say goodbye to each other today?
I think there are changes, absolutely. When you call it a reformation, it evokes Calvin and Luther, and that stuff happened sort of suddenly. It was simmering under the surface for a long time, but then it blew very quickly. I don't think it's going to be a revolution in neuroscience. I hope it's not going to be a revolution, because revolutions don't tend to go down very well, and
very
there's
disruptive.
rush to judgment. You know, the pendulum tends to oscillate to the other extreme. So you make different mistakes, but you're still making mistakes. The way it's going is the way I think is the optimal way that it's going, which is it's slow but steady, and young people are some of the key drivers. There was a lot of young people in Servolo as well, because in San Servolo, because San Servolo, because that meeting was associated with the Advanced School of Neuroscience. So there are, you know, postdocs, and there were even people still doing their graduate studies. So young people, and they are a lot less plagued by unexamined assumptions than their forefathers were. They are more metaphysically neutral. They are sharper in their understanding, but also broader in their understanding. They are more keenly aware that what we are doing is mostly modeling, as opposed to providing a metaphysical account for things. We are modeling things. We are modeling the structure and behavior of things, which is science. That's good science. Science models behavior and structure. So I think this process that is already unfolding, it's unfolding even with the old guard. I'm not going to name names, but you know who they are. They themselves are sort of looking with fresh eyes at everything, because you know, when you hit your head against the wall for long enough, at some point you start looking around to see if is there a better way to go. And that's the embodiment of scientific integrity and honesty. When you really try something, it doesn't work, and then you take a step back and you reevaluate the situation. And the old guard, a lot of the old guard is doing that too. So there's a lot of reason to be hopeful. But of course, as everything in human activity, there are two sides to that coin. So there is a parallel process in which things are becoming increasingly peculiar. And some of it is done by young people too, very ambitious young people who maybe should moderate their ambition and prioritize reason and evidence over ambition. But there are attempts out there to account for consciousness under physicalist premises in a manner that completely ignores what consciousness is, the structure of experience, the qualities of experience. So they're trying to account for something while ignoring everything we know about the thing they're trying to account for. How can you account for something if you ignore what that something is, what its characteristics are, what its properties are? So you see that opposite movement that it violates the edge of plausibility to an extent that is ludicrous. You see, for instance, an attempt to account for the psychedelic experience in terms of a 0.005% increase in brain noise, which, by the way, is not what happens in every case. There are cases in which brain noise is reduced, and these people still have the psychedelic experience. So you would think that anyone who tries to account for an experience in terms of a minuscule increase in brain noise, in other words, brain activity that doesn't fall into any recognizable pattern, desynchronized brain activity. If you do that, then you are presupposing that the experience you're trying to account for is akin to watching very faint TV static. But it's not. It's a psychedelic experience. A psychedelic experience is not faint TV static. It's a coherent experience with lots of recognizable patterns, aliens, universes, other dimensions, profound insights. It's very structured, very meaning-evoking. How can you account for that experience in terms of a minuscule increase in brain noise? No, you only seriously postulate this if you completely ignore what the psychedelic experience is. This is the opposite of IIT. IIT starts from what experience is. In other words, the way you account for something is by first looking at what that something is that you're trying to account for. I mean, this is so obvious, right?
Yeah.
But IIT is unique in pursuing the obvious. There are other streams out there in which people deliberately, completely disregarded that which they are trying to account for. And they get papers published and high positions and grants and funding and whatnot. So that's the opposite movement. But I think I know which one is going to win.
Yeah, I would be hopeful for that, and others can fall into artifact status and relics of assumptions and so forth. Bernardo, I think maybe this is a good place to just hit pause, and maybe sometime down the road we could get together for another conversation like this. But definitely I will work for the audience. We spoke about having a conversation with Dr. Michael Levin, and we'll have Bernardo and Michael back for another conversation. For those of you who have stuck around for this far into the conversation, that'll be a nice teaser for the future. But Bernardo, again, I want to thank you for your time. You're so generous with engaging people like myself, and I very much appreciate that. I'll say goodbye to you after we stop recording, but I just wanted to offer my thanks.
Thanks for having me, Justin. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's an honor every time. YouTube audience, thank you guys so much, especially those of you who are subscribed to the channel. So, all right, let's see.